The sun rose over the vast Mississippi plantation, spilling molten gold across the fields of cotton that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. To outsiders, the estate of Thomas Whitmore seemed the epitome of Southern wealth and order. The grand mansion gleaming under the morning light, the enslaved laborers moving in choreographed precision, and the overseers patrolling with rigid authority. But beneath the illusion of prosperity, a storm was brewing, a storm of vengeance, patience, and deadly calculation. Elijah, a man who had once been a boy bound by chains, had survived years of relentless abuse. Every lash, every humiliation, every cruelty inflicted by Whitmore and his overseers had been etched into his mind, sharpening his resolve like a blade. The other enslaved workers whispered quietly about the master's brutality, but Elijah was different. He had learned to survive, yes, but he had also learned to wait, to observe, to plan, and now the moment for retribution had arrived. For years, he had endured his body bent, but his mind unbroken. And now, he would not merely strike back. He would make Whitmore and every overseer who had ever thrived on fear pay a price so brutal that the memory would linger long after the plantation had fallen silent. This is the story of Elijah, a man who refused to be broken, and who turned the very terror designed to enslave him into a weapon of vengeance. Before we step into this chapter of calculated fury, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it there? Can you imagine standing witness to a storm long brewing, finally unleashed upon a world built on oppression? Drop a comment below, and if stories of defiance and revenge like this grip you, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been hidden in the shadows of Southern estates for far too long. The morning sun spilled into the quarters of the enslaved workers, casting long shadows across the dirt floors. Elijah stirred from his meager bedding, muscles sore from the back-breaking labor he had endured the day before. He had been a slave all his life, born into a world where every breath he took was measured against the whim of Thomas Whitmore, a man whose cruelty was legendary even among the neighboring estates. Whitmore's mansion loomed over the fields like a fortress, its polished white pillars gleaming in the sunlight, a constant reminder of the power imbalance that had defined Elijah's existence. The overseers patrolled with a harshness that mirrored their master's own temper, whips cracking against the ground and the occasional body. Every day was a test of endurance, obedience, and survival. Elijah had learned to bend, to make himself small, to vanish into the work and shadows. But beneath the surface, Elijah's mind was a forge. Each insult, each lash, each public humiliation was absorbed and transformed into something dangerous, a simmering fire that no chain could hold forever. He remembered the time Whitmore had struck him in front of the other enslaved workers for spilling a bucket of water, laughing at the fear that had been forced into his face. He remembered the way the overseers had jeered, taking delight in his pain. And he remembered the whispers of defiance that had stirred in the other quarters, the quiet glimmers of resistance that had taken root over the years. Elijah moved through the morning routine with practiced efficiency, tending to the fields, fixing fences, and feeding the animals, all under the unrelenting eye of the overseers. Every movement was calculated. There was no room for error, no space for defiance that could be seen. Yet, each small act of endurance, each silent act of survival, added to the weight of his resolve. It was during these long, grueling hours that Elijah first conceived of revenge not as a fleeting thought, but as a plan that would require patience, observation, and timing. He knew the risks. He knew the cost. But the abuse he had suffered, and the daily terror imposed on his family and neighbors, had reached a breaking point. Whitmore had made himself untouchable in the eyes of the plantation, but Elijah had learned something the master had never anticipated. Survival can breed cunning, and patience can breed fury. That evening, after the slaves returned to the quarters, Elijah sat quietly by the fire, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Around him, others whispered about the master's latest cruelty. Some spoke in fear, some in muted anger. But Elijah's thoughts were singular, precise. He traced in his mind every route through the plantation, every blind spot, every opportunity that Whitmore's arrogance had left exposed. He considered the overseers, the servants, and even the master himself. Nothing was overlooked. Every detail mattered. The time for fear was over. The time for patience had arrived. And when the moment came, Elijah would strike, not in secret, not in shadows, but in the open, before the entire plantation. For years, he had endured chains, lashes, and humiliation. But the fire in his veins had not been extinguished. It had been carefully nurtured, and now it burned hotter than ever. Elijah's moment of reckoning was coming, and the world would witness a vengeance so calculated, so absolute, that no master or overseer would ever forget it. The sun had barely risen when whispers of the morning routine began through the quarters of the enslaved workers. Elijah moved among them silently, his muscles still aching from yesterday's toil, yet his mind was sharper than it had ever been. Every day under Thomas Whitmore's tyranny had taught him one unshakable truth. Survival required more than endurance. It required observation, cunning, and patience. And now that patience was approaching its limit. It was mid-morning when Whitmore's wrath struck again. A new overseer, emboldened by the master's presence, had come into the fields demanding speed and obedience. Elijah had been tending a stubborn mule, its slow movement causing a slight delay. The overseer, whip raised, barked at him to hurry. Elijah complied, yet even the smallest resistance, a fraction of hesitation, a furrow of the brow was noticed. Whitmore, striding across the fields with his polished boots crunching against the dirt, saw the slight and exploded in fury. "Elijah!" Whitmore's voice rang out, booming across the rows of cotton. His face was twisted with rage, veins throbbing in his temple. "What are you doing? Wasting time again?" The overseer, grinning with sadistic glee, signaled Elijah to step forward. The other enslaved workers, faces pale with fear, moved aside instinctively. Elijah felt the weight of every eye upon him, every heart in the fields beating in terror and anticipation of his punishment. Whitmore approached him, grabbing Elijah by the collar, yanking him toward the open field where the entire plantation could witness. "You'll learn your place today," he hissed. The master raised his hand and struck Elijah across the face, a blow that sent him reeling backward. Laughter erupted from the overseer, echoing across the fields like the tolling of a bell for death. Elijah felt the familiar sting of pain, but this time something inside him shifted. The humiliation, the rage, the years of silent suffering all converged into a single, burning resolve. No more would he bow silently, endure lashes, or allow Whitmore to wield fear as a weapon. The fire that had smoldered for years flared into something darker, something sharp enough to cut through the chains of oppression. Later that night, Elijah sat alone outside the quarters, under the dark velvet sky dotted with stars. The sounds of the plantation, the rustling of the cotton, the soft murmur of exhausted workers filled the night, yet he felt isolated, poised on the edge of a decision that could cost him everything. Every detail of Whitmore's routine replayed in his mind. His habitual walks through the fields, the times he visited the quarters, his schedule for overseeing punishment, and, most importantly, the arrogance that blinded him to the growing anger of those he enslaved. Elijah knew the risks. The plantation's white overseers were loyal to the master, and any hint of rebellion could result in immediate death. But the anger in his veins, the injustice of years spent under cruelty, demanded action. He envisioned a plan, meticulous, brutal, precise. He would wait for the right moment, the perfect opportunity when Whitmore's arrogance would leave him exposed before the entire plantation. It had to be a spectacle, a lesson in fear turned against its wielder. As the fire's glow danced across his face, Elijah reflected on the years of torment he had endured. The whippings, the humiliations, the nights he had watched family members beaten or punished unjustly. Each memory was a spark, each insult a nail hammered into the coffin of patience he had maintained for so long. And now, the time for patience had ended. He would strike, but not in secret, not in shadows. Whitmore's cruelty had always relied on spectacle, on public dominance. Elijah would turn that same stage against him. Every lash, every insult, every humiliation Whitmore had inflicted would be repaid tenfold, and the entire plantation would witness it. By dawn, Elijah's plan had begun to take shape in precise detail. The path Whitmore would take, the timing of the overseer's rounds, and the tools that would deliver his vengeance. He had to be careful. Every step required calculation. Every misstep could cost him his life. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of control, a power that had been denied him since birth. The fire inside him burned hotter than ever. The chains of oppression, both physical and psychological, would soon be shattered. Whitmore had believed himself untouchable. Elijah intended to prove him fatally wrong. The days leading up to the planned reckoning were marked by careful observation and relentless calculation. Elijah moved among the plantation as he always had, a quiet shadow among the cotton rows, tending to his duties with practiced precision. To the overseers and to Whitmore himself, he appeared subdued, compliant, and obedient, the perfect image of the enslaved worker. But beneath the surface, every glance, every movement, and every sound was being catalogued, turned over in his mind, and stored for the moment of his vengeance. Whitmore, as always, was oblivious. The master strutted through the fields with his usual arrogance, barking orders, punishing minor mistakes, and flaunting the absolute power he believed he wielded over the plantation. Each act of cruelty, each public humiliation, only sharpened Elijah's resolve. The man had built his authority on fear, and Elijah had learned how to navigate it, how to appear submissive while plotting an end to it. In the evenings, after the day's labor had ended, Elijah met in secret with a few trusted allies, workers who had endured Whitmore's tyranny alongside him. They whispered in corners of the quarters, their voices low, careful not to attract the attention of prying ears. Together, they discussed the master's routines, his predictable arrogance, and the small windows of opportunity where Elijah could act without immediate interference. "We have one chance," Elijah said quietly, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. "One perfect moment. If we strike too early, we risk death. Too late, and Whitmore will escape or retaliate. Timing is everything." His allies nodded, understanding the gravity of the plan. Some trembled, caught between fear and excitement, while others felt a quiet fire ignite in their chests, the same fire that had sustained Elijah for years. They were bound by suffering and by the shared desire for justice, and now that desire was crystallizing into action. Meanwhile, Whitmore continued to flaunt his power in increasingly reckless ways. He would challenge the stronger workers to physical tasks meant to humiliate, order punishments for minor errors, and parade his wealth and dominance before the neighboring planters when guests visited. His hubris had become predictable, almost theatrical, a flaw that Elijah would exploit. Elijah studied every detail, the times Whitmore would walk past the quarters alone, the routes he favored through the fields, the moments when the overseer's attention was elsewhere. He knew the master's weaknesses, his overconfidence, his vanity, his reliance on fear to control others, and he would turn them against him. At night, Elijah lay on his hard bedding, staring at the ceiling, the memory of each lash and each insult fueling his resolve. The humiliation he had endured, the pain he had absorbed silently, now served a higher purpose. This was not blind vengeance. It was precision, strategy, and inevitability. Whitmore's cruelty would become his undoing. As the day for the planned act approached, the tension on the plantation became almost tangible. Elijah maintained his facade of submission, moving silently among the workers and performing his tasks with exacting care. Yet beneath the calm exterior, a storm brewed, a storm of calculated fury that would shatter the master's reign and leave an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. The other enslaved workers, sensing Elijah's quiet determination, watched him with a mixture of fear and awe. They could not know the full extent of his plan, but they understood that something was different. The man who had always endured, who had survived through compliance and cunning, now moved with purpose. A reckoning was coming, and the plantation would never be the same. Elijah's mind was a careful clockwork of detail and timing. He had rehearsed the steps over and over in his head. The moment Whitmore would step onto the porch, the angle of his approach to the barn where the act would take place, the presence of the overseers who would witness the event, and the swift precision with which the revenge would be executed. Every possibility, every contingency, had been accounted for. By the end of that day, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Elijah's plan had solidified. The tension that had been building for years reached its apex. The master remained oblivious, strutting through the fields, mocking and ordering, unaware that the same man he had tormented for years now held the power to undo him entirely. The stage was set. All that remained was the moment itself. The morning sun rose over the Mississippi plantation like a warning, casting long shadows across the cotton fields that had once symbolized submission. The air was thick with heat and tension, and for Elijah, every breath was measured, every step precise. Today would not be another day of servitude. Today, the plantation would witness the collapse of Thomas Whitmore's reign, and the world would see the consequences of cruelty. Whitmore emerged from the mansion at his usual hour, striding with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. The overseers flanked him, whips at the ready, ensuring that every enslaved worker knew their place. Children, women, and men alike scurried in silent fear, heads bowed, avoiding the gaze of the master whose brutality had left scars, both visible and invisible. Whitmore smiled, oblivious to the storm gathering in plain sight. Elijah moved among the other workers quietly, carrying out his tasks with the practiced obedience that had kept him alive for so long. But beneath the surface, every movement, every glance, every calculated step was part of a larger plan. The tools he had gathered, the careful study of Whitmore's routines, and the knowledge of the plantation's layout all converged into a single, unrelenting purpose: vengeance. By mid-morning, the plantation was busy with the day's work. The overseers patrolled, shouting orders, while Whitmore paused at intervals to flaunt his control, striking a worker here, humiliating another there. The other enslaved men and women whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Elijah. They could see the quiet tension in his posture, the way his eyes never left Whitmore, and the barely contained energy that seemed to radiate from him. Something was about to happen, and they could sense it. Elijah approached the barn where Whitmore would often inspect the tools and supervise the more physically demanding tasks. The plan was simple in execution but terrifying in its inevitability. The master had always believed himself untouchable, that his spectacle of power would go unchallenged. But today, that arrogance would be his undoing. Whitmore stepped into the barn, laughing to himself at the sight of Elijah arranging sacks of cotton. "Move faster, boy," he barked, his voice echoing in the rafters. "Do you think these fields will tend themselves?" Elijah looked up, meeting the master's gaze with a calmness that belied the storm beneath his skin. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, each word measured. "I'll get it done." The other workers held their breath, sensing the tension between the two men. Whitmore laughed again, clearly confident in his authority, unaware that the very man he had tormented for years now held absolute power over him. In a single, fluid motion, Elijah struck. He had waited for this moment for years, watching, learning, and planning. With precision and strength, he overpowered Whitmore, pinning him against the wooden beams of the barn. The overseers, caught by surprise, could barely react before Elijah acted again, wielding the tool he had chosen for this moment of reckoning. The sound of struggle and shock echoed through the plantation, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. The overseers rushed in, but it was too late. Elijah had carried out his vengeance, striking at the core of Whitmore's power in a way that was both brutal and symbolic. The master's cries of disbelief and horror rang through the air, silencing the plantation in a single instant. The other enslaved workers watched from the shadows, some trembling with fear, others frozen in awe. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted so violently that it could not be ignored. Whitmore, the man who had ruled through terror, now lay broken and humiliated. The embodiment of his cruelty turned back upon him. Elijah stepped back, his chest heaving, the culmination of years of suffering and calculation etched into every line of his body. He had endured, he had survived, and now he had exacted justice. The plantation would never forget this day, the day that fear was replaced with reckoning, cruelty with consequence. As the dust settled, Elijah addressed the gathered workers, his voice steady and commanding. "We have endured for too long," he said. "We have suffered for too long. Today, the master learns what it means to fear, and from this day forward, No one here will be broken by cruelty again. The plantation stood in stunned silence. Some cried, some whispered prayers of awe and gratitude, and others simply stared at Elijah, realizing that he had become more than a man. He had become a symbol of vengeance, of defiance, and of unbroken spirit. The day of reckoning had come, and Elijah, long oppressed and long patient, had finally claimed his justice in full view of the world that had once held him down. The plantation was silent after the storm, the echo of Whitmore's cries and the sound of the struggle still ringing faintly in the ears of everyone present. For a brief moment, the enslaved workers dared to breathe freely, though the air remained thick with fear and disbelief. Elijah stood at the center of the barn, chest heaving, eyes blazing, aware that the moment of triumph was fleeting. The repercussions of his actions were already taking shape. The overseers, who had once wielded power with cruel efficiency, now hesitated. Their confidence had been shattered by the sight of Elijah's defiance. Some trembled, unsure whether to flee or attempt retaliation. Others froze completely, their loyalty to Whitmore now meaningless in the face of a master whose authority had been irrevocably broken. The plantation, which had operated as a well-oiled machine of fear, now teetered on the edge of chaos. Elijah's eyes scanned the fields. He knew that the Klan sympathizers in town and loyalist whites would be gathering evidence, whispering rumors, and preparing a counterattack. It was only a matter of hours before news of what he had done spread beyond the boundaries of the plantation. The law, as always, was unlikely to be impartial if it intervened at all. It would be to protect Whitmore's legacy, not justice. Despite the danger, Elijah's resolve remained unbroken. He moved quickly, issuing instructions to the other enslaved workers who had followed him in silent awe. "Gather the supplies," he said, voice steady. "We cannot stay here. They will come for us. Take what you can carry and move toward the river. The woods will hide us if we keep to the shadows." Some workers hesitated, fear evident in their eyes. "But what about the others?" one whispered. "The overseers? The neighbors? They'll hunt us down." "They may try," Elijah said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on the worker's shoulder. "But we will be ready. We've endured worse. Today, we've proven that we are not powerless. Today, we have shown them that cruelty has a price." By evening, Elijah's group had begun moving through the plantation under the cover of darkness. The once familiar landscape felt treacherous and alien, each tree and ridge potentially hiding a pursuer. The hum of insects and the rustle of the cotton fields provided an eerie soundtrack as they made their way to the dense woods that bordered the property. Every step was careful, every movement deliberate. They were fugitives now, hunted by both the overseers who had survived the initial chaos and the wider network of loyalists who would see revenge executed. Yet, amid the fear and uncertainty, there was a sense of empowerment. For the first time, the enslaved workers moved with agency rather than compulsion. They had witnessed Elijah's courage, and it ignited a spark within them. The whispers that had long circulated in hushed tones now carried a newfound confidence. Defiance was possible, and it could be decisive. As they paused near the riverbank, Elijah surveyed the group. Faces illuminated by the moonlight were tense, yet resolute. "We will not just survive," he said quietly. "We will endure. And someday, we will be free not just in body, but in spirit." The river ahead promised concealment and a route away from the plantation, but it also symbolized the peril of the path they had chosen. The journey northward would be fraught with danger. Klan loyalists, bounty hunters, and hostile towns awaited them. Every mile would demand vigilance, courage, and a relentless will to survive. By dawn, the group had reached the edge of the forest, the plantation behind them now a distant silhouette against the rising sunday. Elijah paused, glancing back at the fields he had known all his life, the land that had shaped him, humiliated him, and forged his resolve. Today, it had witnessed a reckoning it would never forget. Whitmore's reign had ended, his authority shattered, yet freedom was still fragile. Elijah knew that the battle was far from over. The Klan would regroup, the overseers would recover, and the wider world would seek to reassert the hierarchy that had oppressed them for generations. Survival required movement, caution, and trust in those few allies who had shared this path with him. Elijah looked at the faces of the men and women around him, the first real smiles in months appearing despite exhaustion and fear. "We've struck a blow today," he said, voice carrying over the gentle rush of the river. "But it's only the beginning. We move north. We find safety. And we make sure that no one will ever look at us as less than human again." The group stepped into the forest, each footfall a promise of survival and resistance. The plantation behind them, once a cage of cruelty, had become a stage for vengeance and defiance, a lesson in the power of patience, rage, and calculated courage. The forest stretched endlessly before Elijah and his group, dense and shadowed, offering both refuge and peril. Each step was deliberate, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. The plantation lay miles behind them now, its fields and cotton rows reduced to a memory of suffering and blood. But that memory carried a new meaning, one of vengeance and the reclamation of dignity. Elijah had struck a blow that would resonate far beyond the boundaries of the estate. The journey northward was grueling. The men and women with him were weary, their bodies aching from long days and nights spent navigating the wilderness, avoiding patrols and bounty hunters. But the fear that had once dominated their lives was replaced by something else: determination. They were alive, and they were free to move, to plan, to survive. Each mile traveled was a triumph over the years of oppression that had sought to define their existence. Elijah, though exhausted, remained vigilant. His eyes scanned the tree line constantly, ears tuned to the faintest sound of pursuit. The Klan would not forgive him, and the plantation's overseers would seek to track them down. But Elijah had anticipated their moves, planned escape routes, and relied on the network of allies who had been quietly aiding fugitive black people for decades. At night, the group huddled around small fires, speaking in whispers about the events that had unfolded. Some spoke in awe of Elijah's audacity, others with fear of what the Klan might do in retaliation. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, there was a shared recognition of what had been accomplished. Elijah had transformed from a man who endured oppression into a symbol of resistance. His actions had shattered the master's power in a single, brutal act witnessed by the entire plantation, a lesson in consequence that would not be forgotten. Days turned into weeks as they continued their trek. They crossed rivers, hid in thickets, and moved through isolated settlements where allies provided food and shelter. Each safe house offered a brief respite, yet the threat of pursuit never fully disappeared. Sorry. Elijah had not only acted for himself but for the countless others who had been subjected to the cruelty of masters like Whitmore. His vengeance was both personal and collective, a message written in blood and courage. When they finally approached the northern states, a sense of cautious hope settled over the group. Freedom was no longer theoretical, it was tangible, just within reach. They moved more freely, the shadows less threatening, the air lighter with every mile. Elijah knew that even though the Klan might still pursue them, their reach was waning. In the north, allies awaited, people committed to protecting those who had fled bondage and terror. Elijah paused on a hilltop, gazing back toward the south. The plantation, though distant, remained etched in his mind, the site of years of suffering, humiliation, and now, vengeance. He thought of Whitmore, broken and castrated before the entire estate, and felt the weight of his triumph tempered by the gravity of his actions. Justice had been served, but it had come at a cost. Violence had left its mark, and the path to true peace was still ahead. Arriving in the northern safe settlement, Elijah and his companions were greeted by those who had fought for freedom long before they had even dreamed of it. The community welcomed them cautiously, aware that the Klan's influence still lingered even here. But Elijah's reputation, whispered along the escape routes and networks of freedom fighters, preceded him. He was no longer just a man. He was a symbol of retribution and the unyielding spirit of the oppressed. In the following weeks, Elijah worked with the community, sharing knowledge, aiding others who were escaping, and building a life that was no longer dominated by fear. Though haunted by memories of what had occurred, he also recognized that his actions had changed the trajectory of his own life and those of the people who had witnessed them. The story of the castration, of the defiance in broad daylight, became legend. a tale whispered among enslaved and freed people alike. A demonstration that even the most oppressive systems could be challenged, and even the cruelest masters were not untouchable. Years later, Elijah would reflect on the events that had defined him. He had survived, led, and inspired. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer dictated his life. Whitmore's reign was finished, and the plantation had become a symbol of both terror and retribution. Elijah's legacy, cemented in courage and calculated vengeance, would live on in the memory of those who had endured oppression and those who had risen to challenge it. The act of revenge had been bloody, shocking, and brutal, but it had been justice. And in a world that had sought to strip him of his humanity, Elijah had reclaimed it, one fearless step at a time,